In the pre-dawn hours of Sunday, December 7, 1941, Japan inflicted a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. The attack destroyed or damaged 18 U.S. vessels, including 8 battleships. President Roosevelt was in the White House, finishing up his lunch when news of the attack reached Washington. The next day, at 12:30 p.m., he delivered his famous speech before Congress, asking for a declaration of war. Roosevelt was furious with the attack. He summoned his military counselors and demanded America find a way to strike back and attack Tokyo. The challenge facing war planners was that America had no bases in the region to operate from. Japan had established an empire that stretched across more than 20 million square miles and 7 time zones. Roosevelt pressed his military leaders, U.S. Fleet Commander Admiral Ernest King and Army Air Force Commander General Hap Arnold, to find a way. One of Admiral King's subordinates, Navy Captain Francis Lowe, came up with the idea of flying a twin-engine B-25 Army bomber off an aircraft carrier, something that had never before been tried. With the concept in mind, the job of planning the raid was assigned to 45-year-old Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle, a decorated aviator and former barnstorming pilot. Doolittle subsequently selected 79 volunteer airmen from the 17th Bombardment Group for the planned raid. Those men volunteered in South Carolina at what was then the Columbia Army Air Base. The crews then transferred to Eglin Field in the Florida Panhandle to train with the Navy pilot to learn the art of carrier takeoffs. One of the crews was number 7. From left, Lieutenant Charles McClure, navigator, Lieutenant Ted Lawson, pilot, Lieutenant Robert Clever, bombardier, Lieutenant Dean Davenport, co-pilot, and my dad, Corporal David Thatcher, flight engineer gunner. This is a recreation of crew number 7's plane, the Ruptured Duck. The plan called for the planes to lift off from an aircraft carrier, bomb key industrial cities in Japan, and then to fly on to airfields in mainland China. A task force under the command of Vice Admiral Bull Halsey would carry Doolittle and his men to within a few hundred miles of Tokyo. That task force consisted of 16 warships, including 2 aircraft carriers, 4 cruisers, 8 destroyers, and 2 oilers, and more than 10,000 men. The task force would operate in radio silence, steaming 5,224 miles to the enemy's backyard. On April 2, 1942, just 16 weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the carrier Hornet departed San Francisco bound for Tokyo. The carrier's only protection was the task force of warships that accompanied it. The task force was supported by 2 tankers and 2 submarines. Tied down on the deck of the Hornet and with wheels chalked stood 16 B-25 Army bombers. The bombers had so little room that the tail of the 16th plane dangled over the carrier's fantail. The task force steamed across the northern Pacific, taking a route just south of the polar front that guaranteed rough weather and limited the likelihood of running into Japanese ships. The weather was so rough that refueling the ships at sea proved a challenge. Each hour, each mile, took the American ships closer and closer to the enemy's backyard. As the task force neared Japan on April 17, 1942, Doolittle and his men held a brief ceremony on board the Hornet, wiring Japanese medals previously given to American sailors in 1908 to a bomb that was then placed on my dad's plane. A fleet of Japanese picket boats armed with radios to flash reports of any approaching enemy fleet operated from 80 to 1,000 miles offshore. The American task force ran into the Japanese line of defense shortly past daybreak on April 18, 1942. Upon sighting the boats, American pilots and gunners sprang into action, destroying several of the picket boats and capturing 5 prisoners of war. On board the carrier Hornet, it was time for Doolittle and his men to go. The Hornet was still more than 800 miles from Tokyo, 200 miles further than what Doolittle believed his planes could have enough fuel to bomb Japan and reach China. So, taking off now was essentially a suicide mission. Doolittle climbed into the cockpit of the first bomber. He flashed the thumbs-up sign to the signal officer who waved his flag in circles, signaling Doolittle to push the throttle all the way forward. The signal officer dropped the flag and Doolittle released the brakes. The bomber roared down the flight deck at 8:20 a.m. The bomber roared up and into the gray skies over the carrier's bow. Sailors crowded along the flight deck, and the carrier's island erupted in cheers. The other 15 bombers followed Doolittle, flying just above the wave tops en route to Japan, reaching the coast about noon. This photo of the Yokosuka Naval Station is one of only 2 known photos shot from the bomber cockpits during the raid. In this photo are several destroyed homes in Tokyo. Pilot Harold Watson's attack destroyed this wooden factory building adjacent to a hazardous materials warehouse. Here is a crater left by one 500-pound demolition bomb. All told, the raid killed 87 people, including some children. Another 151 were seriously wounded, and 311 others suffered minor injuries. The raiders obliterated 112 buildings and damaged another 53. This bomb crater near the Asahi Electrical Manufacturing Corporation factory in the Tokyo area measured more than 15 feet wide and 10 feet deep. This is a photo from the Yomiuri Shimbun newspaper afterward, showing one bomber tearing through the skies with anti-aircraft bursts around it. The headlines are filled with propaganda. In the U.S., the Doolittle Raid had a significant impact, raising morale and providing America with its first victory of the war. All 16 bombers made it out of Japan. Low on fuel, plane number 8 flew northwest across the Japanese mainland to Vladivostok, Russia, where authorities interned the crew for 13 months. The rest flew to mainland China, where low on fuel, air crews either bailed out or crash-landed along the coast, getting help from locals and missionaries. This is a map showing locations where Raider crews crashed or parachuted, and my dad's crew was right there, number 7. This is a picture of Doolittle sitting alongside the wing of his bomber the day after the raid. He was initially despondent following the raid, as he thought he would be court-martialed after 15 of the 16 B-25s were destroyed. The air crews, scattered across several hundred miles, had to then find their way overland. Here is a photo of Doolittle reunited with his crew. After crew number 7, the Ruptured Duck crash-landed off Nantien Island, seriously injuring all the crew except my father. My dad saved the lives of the crew by convincing Chinese villagers and guerrillas to take them to safety and administering to his injured crew for the next several days. 3 raiders were killed during bailout. 8 others were captured by the Japanese. A few of the raiders were injured, none worse than Ruptured Duck pilot Ted Lawson, who later had to have his left leg amputated by the mission's doctor in a rural Chinese hospital, the Enza Clinic, located in Zhejiang province. The other raiders had to make their way across rural China using any transportation available, including sedan chairs and rickshaws. One crew even rode miniature ponies. Everywhere the raiders went in China, they were celebrated as heroes. That was made official when the crews reached Chongqing, China's wartime capital. There, Madame Chiang Kai-shek awarded them Chinese commendation medals. Doolittle's biggest honor awaited him in Washington. President Roosevelt presented him with the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award for heroism. For 8 of the raiders captured by the Japanese, the story was far from over. The raiders suffered horrific torture, beatings, and waterboarding. The raiders were put on trial and convicted in a sham proceeding that lasted less than 30 minutes. The Japanese sentenced them to death, but commuted the sentences of 5 of them to life in prison. The Japanese came for Billy Farrow, Dean Hallmark, and Harold Spatz on the afternoon of October 15, 1942, taking them out to Public Cemetery No. 1 on the outskirts of Shanghai. The raiders were made to kneel and then bound to 3 crosses. The Japanese then placed a white cloth around the airmen's heads, each with a black dot drawn to mark the center of the forehead just above the nose. Each raider was then killed by a single shot. The other raiders would spend 40 months in Japan's notorious POW camps, where Raider Bob Metter starved to death. This is a message the raiders carved into the floor of one prison cell. To prevent America from ever using coastal airfields and to punish the locals who helped Doolittle and his men, the Japanese launched a 3-month campaign against China. That campaign led to an estimated 250,000 Chinese deaths. Japanese troops cut the ears and noses off villagers, set others on fire, and drowned families in wells. The Japanese also torched entire towns and unleashed bacteriological warfare in the form of plague, anthrax, cholera, and typhoid. Yingtan was one of the cities destroyed by the Japanese. Besides the initial boost to U.S. morale and it being the first victory by the U.S. in the Pacific theater, the Doolittle Raid also prompted the Japanese to make an ill-fated grab for Midway in June 1942, a disastrous naval battle that cost Japan 4 aircraft carriers and ultimately shifted the balance of power in the Pacific in favor of the United States. Dad was promoted to staff sergeant and was awarded the Silver Star for his bravery in saving the lives of his crew. His other decorations included the Distinguished Flying Cross, Air Medal with 4 oak leaf clusters, and the Chinese Army, Navy, and Air Corps Medal, Class A, First Grade. In 1943, Crew No. 7 pilot Ted Lawson wrote the first account of the Doolittle Raid, titled 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, which became a nationwide bestseller. 30 Seconds Over Tokyo was made into a movie in 1944 and received an Academy Award for Best Special Effects. The movie starred Spencer Tracy as Jimmy Doolittle, Van Johnson as Ted Lawson, and Robert Walker as David Thatcher. During leave, Dad visited the set of 30 Seconds Over Tokyo. Pictured are actors Van Johnson, who played Ted Lawson, Robert Walker, who played David Thatcher, the real David Thatcher, Spencer Tracy, who played Jimmy Doolittle, and Dean Davenport, Crew No. 7 co-pilot, who served as a technical advisor on the film. Doolittle had promised his men that if they survived the raid, he would throw them all a party at his expense. With the war finally over, he held a gathering in Miami in December 1945, starting a tradition that carried on for more than 7 decades before ending in 2013 when 3 of the last surviving Raiders gathered for a final time in Dayton, Ohio. In February 2015, the children of the Doolittle Raiders incorporated as a nonprofit dedicated to keeping the legacy of the Doolittle Raiders alive. I serve as president of the group. On April 15, 2015, Congress presented the Doolittle Tokyo Raiders with the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor they can bestow. At the time, Dad was one of the 2 surviving members of the Doolittle Raid. On April 18, 2015, he and co-survivor Lieutenant Colonel Richard Cole presented the Congressional Gold Medal to the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force, where it is on permanent display as part of a display on the Doolittle Raiders. In September 2015, I traveled to China. A portion of my trip was dedicated to retracing the footsteps of my father's crew. This is a map showing Raider sites in China. Let me point to that. And this is where Dad's crash site was. Our trip to the island and the beach where my father's plane crash landed was facilitated by 2 Chinese nationals, a retired Chinese party official and an amateur historian who had visited and mapped the various sites where the Raiders landed in China. I was later told I was the first American to visit the island since the Raiders had been there 73 years earlier. This is the strip of beach that Ted Lawson saw where he thought he could land the Ruptured Duck. It's flat and long. This is a shot at low tide of the area on Nantien Island where the Ruptured Duck crash landed in the surf the evening of April 18, 1942, after hitting a wave with its wheels down. The 4 other members of the crew were thrown out of the front of the plane on impact and seriously injured. Dad was in the back and escaped injury aside from being knocked out. After the plane crash landed and the 5 crew members had made it up to the beach, Chinese fishermen came down from the village above to check on the crew. They subsequently transported the crew up to a hut in the village. This is the area looking up from the beach leading to the village. This is a shot of the village. This elderly Chinese woman is propping herself up with a hollow fire suppression rod that was part of my dad's plane. She subsequently gave it to me. This is a close-up of the fire suppression rod she gave me. Her husband had found it as a child after my father's plane crashed and had kept it for 73 years. I subsequently acquired another piece of the Ruptured Duck from a Chinese resident of the island. The cover of the inboard camera that had been right below my dad's feet where he sat in the rear turret of the plane. This is the interior of the building where Dad's crew spent the night on the island after their plane crash landed. It did not look like it had changed much in the past 73 years. This is a canal where Dad's crew traversed via a boat after their plane crash landed. Pursuing Japanese troops were not far behind. The crew was later loaded onto a Chinese boat and taken across the East China Sea from the island to the mainland. After reaching the mainland, the crew was taken inland to the Enza Clinic in Linhai for medical care. This is the operating room in the Enza Clinic where Ted Lawson, the pilot of crew number 7, had his gangrenous left leg amputated. This is a cart containing bandages and syringes that were placed next to the operating table. This is the operating table with the carts on each side. This is the room where Ted Lawson recovered after the surgery. This is the room in the Enza Clinic where my dad stayed. They have a display dedicated to Dad over the fireplace. These are photos of me in the room dedicated to my dad at the Enza Clinic that were taken during my first visit to China in September 2015. This is a photo of members of crew number 7 who were injured in the crash landing and recuperated at the Enza Clinic. Navigator Charles McClure left, whose shoulders were dislocated, co-pilot Dean Davenport, who had cuts to his leg and his head, and bombardier Robert Clever, who was nearly scalped when he was thrown out of the bomb fuselage. These murals were part of an outside Doolittle Raiders display in Linhai Township. The photo in the upper right corner on the right is of Dad. This is another part of the outside display. Dad was part of the 95th Bomb Squadron, the Kicking Mules. Below that image is Ruptured Duck nose art, and the photo in the upper right is of his crew. During the month of September 2015, Linhai Township was showing 30 seconds over Tokyo each night on this outdoor screen. This is the exterior of the air raid shelter in Chuzhou, carved into a limestone cliff where many of the raiders, including my dad, hid during daily Japanese bombings. William Fitzhugh and Douglas Radney, 2 Doolittle Raiders, carved their names into the outside wall of the air raid shelter at Chuzhou when they were hiding there. This is an inside view of the air raid shelter looking out. The shelter could hold up to 40 to 50 people at a time when the Japanese were bombing Chuzhou. This is a shot of some of the Doolittle Raiders gathered outside the air raid shelter. In October 2018, I led a group of Raider children, grandchildren, other family and friends on a China tour. Here we are gathered at the front of the air raid shelter after I led a toast to the Doolittle Raiders. Later, I participated in the grand opening of the new Chuzhou Memorial Hall to the Doolittle Raiders, which was constructed after my first trip to China in September 2015 by the Chuzhou municipal government, and filled with Raider artifacts donated by Raider family members and others. These are some of the displays and exhibits in the Memorial Hall. This is the outside entrance to the Memorial Hall. As part of the Children of the Doolittle Raiders outreach efforts, we started a modest scholarship program at a middle school in Chuzhou after my initial visit to China. Each year, we sponsor an essay contest for students to write in English their impressions of the Doolittle Raid's impact upon China. These were the winners of the contest in 2018. This is another Doolittle Raider Memorial Hall in the city of Jiangshan. The bronze figures represent one of the Raider crews and their Chinese benefactors. Lieutenant Colonel Richard E. Dick Cole, pictured here with the Raider crest, was the last surviving member of the Doolittle Raid. He passed away on April 9, 2019 at the age of 103. My dad passed away on June 22, 2016 at the age of 94. In 1959, in honor of the Doolittle Raid, the citizens of Tucson, Arizona presented a set of 80 sterling silver goblets to the Raiders. Each goblet was inscribed with the name of each Raider, both right side up and upside down. At each Raider reunion, the surviving Raiders would drink a toast to their comrades who had passed away the year previously using a bottle of Hennessy cognac that accompanied the goblets. After the toast, the goblets of each of the deceased Raiders were turned over. In April 2017, at a ceremony in the U.S. Air Force Museum marking the 75th anniversary of the Doolittle Raid, final Raider Dick Cole turned over my dad's goblet and provided a final toast. Dick Cole's goblet, the final one still standing, was turned over at a ceremony about a month ago on April 18th, the 80th anniversary of the raid in Fort Walton Beach, Florida. In 2016, the Air Force announced that the new heavy bomber, which will ultimately replace the B-1 and B-2 bombers now in service, would be named the B-21 Raider in honor of the Doolittle Raiders. The B-21 is now in production, and a public ceremony will be held later this year in California when the first plane is unveiled.